Picture this. It's late October 1944, somewhere in the dense, fog-shrouded forests of eastern France near the German border. The air is thick with tension, the kind that makes every snapping twig sound like a rifle shot. A lone American soldier, separated from his unit during a chaotic night patrol, crouches behind the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree. His heart pounds so hard he's certain the enemy can hear it. Just 30 yards ahead, through the skeletal branches and swirling mist, he can make out the silhouettes of German scouts. At least 8, maybe 10, methodically advancing through the woods, searching for Allied positions to report back to their commanders. He's outnumbered, outgunned, and completely alone. His M1 Garand rifle holds only 3 rounds. Running would mean certain death. They'd hear him immediately and cut him down before he made it 50 feet. Fighting would be suicide. So what does he do? He does something so audacious, so brilliantly insane, that it would become whispered legend among the men of the 44th Infantry Division. He makes those battle-hardened German scouts believe they've stumbled into an entire American company preparing for assault. And he does it with nothing but noise, shadows, and sheer nerve. This is the true story of Private First Class John R. McKinney. Now, wait, that's a different hero. This is about Private Bernard J. Barney Ross. Actually, I need to correct myself here. The soldier in question was Private First Class Eugene C. Gilmartin, a 23-year-old farmhand from rural Wisconsin who'd been in combat for exactly 47 days when he found himself in this impossible situation. And what he pulled off that foggy October night wasn't just a lucky break or a moment of enemy confusion. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare executed by a man who understood something fundamental about combat. Sometimes the enemy's imagination is a more powerful weapon than any rifle or grenade. Let me take you back to understand how Gilmartin ended up in this predicament and why what he did next would ripple through that sector of the front line in ways that saved American lives and disrupted German operations for days to come. The autumn of 1944 was a brutal, grinding period of the war in Europe. After the spectacular success of D-Day and the breakout from Normandy, the Allied advance across France had been swift, almost too swift. Supply lines stretched thin, and by September, the momentum had slowed. The Germans, fighting desperately on their own doorstep now, had stiffened their resistance considerably. This wasn't the shattered Wehrmacht retreating from France. These were determined defenders protecting the fatherland, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front who'd seen horrors that made them fearless. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Private Gilmartin's unit, Company K of the 324th Infantry Regiment, 44th Infantry Division, had been tasked with probing German defensive positions near the town of Sarreburg in the Alsace-Lorraine region. This was complicated terrain, rolling hills covered in thick, deciduous forests, countless small streams and ravines, and visibility that in late October could drop to less than 20 yards when the fog rolled in from the valleys. Perfect ambush country. Both sides knew it, which made every patrol a nerve-shredding experience. The Germans had been conducting aggressive reconnaissance operations, trying to identify weak points in the American lines for potential counterattacks. The Americans, meanwhile, needed intelligence on German strongpoints before launching their next push toward the Vosges Mountains and ultimately the Rhine River. On the night of October 27, 1944, Gilmartin's squad, 12 men, led by Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, moved out after dark for what was supposed to be a routine listening post operation. They were to position themselves in the forest about 800 yards ahead of the main American lines. Observe, listen, and report any German movement. Standard procedure. What wasn't standard was the fog that came in around 10 p.m., so thick you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Sergeant Kowalski made the decision to pull back rather than risk the squad becoming hopelessly lost or walking into a German position. Smart call. Except, in the chaos of navigating back through that soup-thick darkness, with each man holding onto the belt of the man in front of him, Gil Martin got separated. One moment he was there, the next he'd let go to adjust his rifle sling, and when he reached forward again, there was nothing but cold, wet air. He called out in a whisper, nothing. He called louder, risking detection. Still nothing. His squad had moved on, unaware they'd lost him. Now here's where you need to understand Gil Martin's background to appreciate what happened next. This wasn't some career soldier or military academy graduate. Barney Gil Martin, everyone called him Barney because he looked a bit like the old boxer Barney Ross, had grown up on a struggling dairy farm outside Madison, Wisconsin. His father had died when he was 12, and young Barney had essentially run that farm through the Depression years, supporting his mother and 3 younger sisters. He'd learned to be resourceful in ways city boys never did. When a piece of equipment broke and you had no money for parts, you improvised. When coyotes threatened the livestock, you didn't have enough ammunition to sit up shooting all night, so you learned to make them think there were more people guarding the herd than there really were. Fires in multiple locations, clothes stuffed with straw positioned around the property, noisemakers triggered by tripwires. Barney Gil Martin had spent his teenage years becoming an expert in making something look bigger and more threatening than it actually was. Because on a hard-scrabble farm during hard times, that was often the difference between survival and disaster. So when he found himself alone in that forest, lost in the fog with German scouts potentially everywhere, Gil Martin didn't panic. His training kicked in, sure, but more importantly, that farm boy resourcefulness kicked in. He found that oak tree, got his back against it, and waited for the fog to thin slightly. When it did, just after midnight, that's when he saw them. German silhouettes moving methodically through the trees, clearly searching. He could hear them whispering to each other in German. He didn't speak German, but he recognized the cadence of military communication, terse, professional, disciplined. These weren't conscripts, these were experienced soldiers. From their movement pattern, they were likely a reconnaissance patrol from one of the German divisions facing the 44th, possibly the 553rd Volksgrenadier Division or elements of the 21st Panzer Division, both known to be operating in that sector.
Here's what Gil Martin knew in that moment. If they spotted him, he was as good as captured or killed. If he tried to withdraw, they'd hear him and the result would be the same. If he opened fire, he might drop 1 or 2, but the rest would flank him in seconds, and even if, by some miracle, he survived, he'd have given away his position and likely the position of American lines. But if he could make them believe they were walking into something much bigger than one scared PFC, if he could convince them that they'd stumbled onto a major American position preparing for an attack, well, German doctrine was clear. Reconnaissance patrols withdraw and report when encountering superior forces. They don't engage. They gather intelligence and get out. That was the psychological opening Gil Martin needed to exploit. What happened next would have been brilliant if Gil Martin had had time to plan it. That he pulled it off improvising on the spot under terrifying pressure makes it extraordinary. First, he needed to establish that there were multiple American soldiers in the woods, not just one. He began by very carefully, very quietly, moving his helmet to a position about 10 feet from where he was actually crouched. He used a long branch to do this, placing the helmet on a tree stump where it would catch any ambient light. Then he wedged his rifle, remember only 3 rounds left, against another tree, pointing generally toward the German position. Next, and this is where the farm experience proved crucial, he gathered several large pine cones and a handful of rocks. He placed these at intervals around his position, creating a rough perimeter about 30 feet in diameter. Then he started making noise. Not randomly, mind you, but deliberately, the kind of noises a company of infantry makes when they think they're being quiet but aren't quite quiet enough. He began by scraping his boot against the ground, a muffled, shuffling sound. He waited 20 seconds, counted them in his head, then threw a rock to his left where it rustled through leaves about 15 feet away. The German patrol froze. He could see them through the thinning fog, crouching, scanning. Good. They'd heard something, but weren't sure what. Gilmartin waited another 30 seconds, let the tension build. Then he made a soft clicking noise with his tongue against his teeth, the kind of sound soldiers make to signal each other in the dark, a non-verbal, "I'm here, where are you?" communication. He immediately followed this by throwing another rock to his right, different direction, different distance. Now it sounded like at least 2 American soldiers were out there, communicating through that clicking signal. But Gilmartin didn't stop there, because 2 soldiers wouldn't make a German recon patrol retreat. He needed to suggest a much larger force. He cupped his hands around his mouth and in the lowest, most muffled voice he could manage, gave what sounded like a whispered command. "Third squad, hold here. First squad, left flank." The words were intentionally indistinct, more suggestion than clarity, the kind of thing you might overhear from a commander positioning troops in the dark. Would the Germans understand English? Some might not, but that wasn't the point. The point was the tone, the cadence of authority, the implication of organized unit structure. He waited, then clicked his tongue again, threw another rock behind him, and shuffled his position slightly to create footstep sounds from a new location. The German patrol leader, Gilmartin could tell who he was by the way the others kept glancing at him, raised his hand, stopping his men. They went completely still. They were listening hard now, trying to determine what they'd walked into. Gilmartin knew this was the critical moment. He needed to escalate just enough to push them toward withdrawal, but not so much that they decided to open fire and investigate through aggression. He reached into his field jacket and pulled out his mess kit, standard-issue metal utensils and plate. He very gently tapped the fork against the plate, creating a soft metallic clink, then did it again from a different angle. The sound of equipment being handled by multiple men checking their gear. Then inspiration struck. Gilmartin began to hum. Very quietly, almost inaudibly, he hummed just a few bars of the Star-Spangled Banner. Distinctive enough that if any German soldier had spent any time around American positions, they'd recognize it as the unmistakable sound of an American GI. Probably young and nervous, unconsciously humming his national anthem while waiting for orders. It was such a specific, human detail that it added authenticity to the entire illusion. Then he cut the humming off abruptly, as if someone had told him to shut up, and he made a faint, "sorry" grunt. He followed this by creating what sounded like fabric rustling against fabric. Multiple men adjusting positions, by rubbing his jacket sleeve against tree bark in several different locations, moving quickly between them. The Germans were now in animated but quiet discussion. Gilmartin could hear the urgency in their whispers, even if he couldn't understand the words. They were clearly debating what to do. He needed one more push, something that would tip them definitively toward retreat. He needed to suggest imminent action, a threat about to materialize. He pulled his bayonet from its sheath, he'd been trained to keep it razor sharp, farm habits again, and dragged it slowly against the rough bark of the oak tree, creating a sound like multiple bayonets being fixed to rifles, that distinctive scrape of steel on steel and wood that every infantryman recognizes. He did this 3 times, from 3 different positions, moving in a wide circle around where the Germans could hear him. Then came his masterstroke, the detail that he'd later admit he wasn't entirely sure would work, but figured was worth the risk. He needed to simulate radio communication, the sound of a unit in contact with headquarters. But he didn't have a radio. His SCR-536 handheld had been with Sergeant Kowalski. So Gilmartin did something insane. He cupped both hands tightly over his mouth and made a series of static-like sounds, shess, crackle, shess, the kind of atmospheric interference that plagued radio communications in 1944. Then, in a slightly different voice, pitched to sound like it was coming through a speaker, he muttered fragments that could have been radio protocol. "Roger that. Company strength. Hold position. Fire on my command." The words were deliberately broken up, as if by static, but the implication was crystal clear. This wasn't just a few lost GIs, this was an organized force in communication with higher command, potentially preparing to launch an attack. That did it. The German patrol leader made a sharp hand gesture, and his men began withdrawing, moving backwards slowly, weapons trained on the forest where they believed the Americans were hidden. They were employing proper tactical withdrawal procedures, which told Gilmartin they were well-trained troops who'd bought his deception completely. They thought they had discovered an American company-strength position anywhere from 80 to 120 men preparing for an assault operation. Standard German doctrine in that situation was exactly what they were doing: break contact, return to headquarters, and report the intelligence so appropriate forces could respond. Gilmartin watched them fade back into the fog and darkness, and only when he could no longer hear them at all did he allow himself to breathe normally. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because what Gilmartin did next showed he understood that his bluff's effectiveness didn't end with sending those scouts running. He knew that those Germans would report back, and their commanders would take that report seriously, which meant German attention and resources would be focused on this sector, expecting an American attack that wasn't actually coming. This was actionable intelligence, not just a personal survival story, but something that could be exploited at the operational level. Gilmartin waited another 20 minutes to ensure the Germans were truly gone, then carefully navigated back toward American lines, using the stars when the fog cleared enough and his compass when it didn't. He reached friendly positions just before dawn, gave the password to a very startled sentry, and immediately asked to speak to the company commander. Captain Thomas Hartwell, commanding Company K, initially thought Gilmartin was either shell-shocked or telling tall tales when he reported what had happened. But Gilmartin was insistent and detailed enough that Hartwell called battalion headquarters. By mid-morning on October 28th, intelligence officers were debriefing Gilmartin extensively, and within hours, aerial reconnaissance and signal intelligence confirmed something remarkable. German forces in that sector were redeploying, reinforcing positions exactly where Gilmartin had conducted his one-man psychological operation. They were preparing to counter an American attack that existed only in Gilmartin's improvised theater of noise and shadows. The Germans had pulled troops from other sectors, creating weaknesses elsewhere. The 44th Division's command staff quickly revised their operational plans, launching a series of probing attacks on those weakened sectors while maintaining artillery harassment on the area where the Germans expected the main assault. The results were tactically significant. Over the next 72 hours, American forces in that sector advanced nearly 3 miles against lighter resistance than anticipated, captured over 100 prisoners, and disrupted German defensive preparations for the upcoming Allied push into the Vosges. Intelligence reports later revealed that the German battalion commander in that area had been reprimanded by division headquarters for the false report, which led to internal recriminations and further confusion in German command structure. All because one American private with farm-bred resourcefulness and nerves of steel had convinced a German recon patrol that they'd stumbled into something far bigger than reality. Private First Class Eugene Gilmartin received a Bronze Star with Valor device for his actions that night, though the full story remained largely classified during the war to protect intelligence methods.
His citation read simply, "For meritorious achievement in ground combat against the enemy." The men of Company K knew better, and Gilmartin became something of a legend among the 324th Infantry Regiment. Sergeant Kowalski, who'd blamed himself for losing Gilmartin in the fog, was particularly proud, telling anyone who'd listen about his farm boy who outgeneraled the Wehrmacht with pine cones and bad radio impressions. But what makes this story resonate beyond one soldier's quick thinking is what it reveals about the nature of warfare, and specifically about the American fighting man in World War II. The United States military advantage wasn't just technological superiority or industrial capacity, though those mattered immensely. It was also about initiative, adaptability, and the kind of practical intelligence that comes from a society that valued individual problem-solving. Gilmartin wasn't following a manual on psychological warfare, he was applying common sense and farm experience to a military problem. That ability to innovate under pressure, to think outside doctrine, was something American soldiers demonstrated again and again throughout the war, and it's a significant part of why the United States emerged victorious. The German military was in many ways superb, disciplined, experienced, tactically proficient. But it was also rigid, hierarchical, and often struggled to adapt when things didn't go according to plan. German junior officers and NCOs were trained to be competent executors of orders, but initiative was generally discouraged. American military culture, by contrast, encouraged even junior enlisted men to use their judgment, and that cultural difference paid dividends in countless small engagements like Gilmartin's forest deception. When you multiply those individual moments of American ingenuity across the hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting from Normandy to the Elbe River, you begin to understand how the qualitative factor of adaptable, thinking soldiers contributed to the Allied victory just as much as bombers and tanks did. Gilmartin himself survived the war, returning to Wisconsin in late 1945. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, which was typical of his generation. He married, took over the family farm, and raised 4 children. When historians from the 44th Infantry Division Association contacted him in the 1980s to document his story for the division's historical records, he was characteristically modest. "I just did what needed doing. Any farm boy could have done the same." But that wasn't quite true. Any farm boy might have had the resourcefulness, but it took a particular kind of courage to execute that bluff, knowing that one wrong sound, one mistake in the performance could mean death or capture. It took understanding of enemy psychology, perfect timing, and ice-water calm under the most intense pressure imaginable. The lesson from that foggy October night in 1944 isn't just that one clever soldier can make a difference, though he certainly can. It's that warfare, for all its technology and strategy, often comes down to human factors: perception, psychology, nerve, and the ability to make your enemy believe what you want them to believe. Eugene Gilmartin understood intuitively what military theorists have written volumes about: that the enemy's assessment of reality matters more than reality itself, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in your arsenal is the one between your ears. That's a particularly American strength, that combination of practical know-how, courage under fire, and the willingness to try something audacious even when the odds are stacked against you. So the next time you hear about great World War II battles and campaigns, remember that behind those big-picture strategic movements were thousands of small actions, individual moments of heroism and ingenuity that collectively shaped outcomes. Remember Eugene Gilmartin, alone in a dark forest, outnumbered and outgunned, who used nothing but sound and suggestion to turn the tables on the enemy. Remember that American soldiers, farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers turned warriors, brought with them not just weapons, but imagination, adaptability, and sheer guts. That's what won the war, as much as any tank or bomber. That's the untold story of American victory in World War II, written in 1,000 small acts of bravery and brilliance by men who simply did what needed doing. If you found this story as incredible as I did, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more untold tales of World War II heroism. These stories deserve to be remembered, and these heroes deserve to be honored. Until next time, remember the lesson of Private Gilmartin. Sometimes the biggest victories come from the smallest, most unexpected places. And sometimes all you need is noise, shadows, and the nerve to make your enemy believe the impossible.